Chapter 36. Koga and Ganon. Consider Koga. In another time, another life, Koga was at the center of a cult, his position fortified by and actively enhancing his personal charisma. Learned but weak, secure in his overconfidence. Almost comedic. That same man still lived, somewhere in the thing that now used his name. Surely it had been the same man who had traveled to Hyrule Castle, sneaking around or averting the eyes of the attendant guardians, gazing up in awe and terror at the green light that shone from the highest tower, stopping his ears against the clamor of a man fighting with something that was far worse than a god. Surely it had been the same man who had stood on the precipice, looking down into the pit where the battle for the world was being waged, and descended on his long rope. Surely it had been the same man who had seen the lull in the battle, when his master and the eternal enemy had stood gathering their strength. Surely it had been the same man who called out to Ganon, who received an answer. It was not the same man who escaped from that pit. Zelda had said that Ganon had changed Koga, but that was not wholly true. The core of him was still intact, buried between layers of malice and power so complex that he wasn't able to identify that his behavior, his words, were no longer his own. When he looked into a mirror, he saw the curse growing underneath his skin, pushing at his flesh, begging to be released, and he saw this as a new self. It was still him, Koga insisted. Zelda's accusation was, very nearly, an affirmation. But Koga still lived. He still remembered. He still experienced the world through the filter of Ganon's power. He felt it as the shaky girl's soul was snatched from her body, pulled to some remote place that Koga was not privy to. He felt it as the princess realized what had happened and her power guttered. He summoned up all of the infinite strength that Ganon had given to him. The more he drew, the more he was Ganon, the more he could taste the agony in the air, the fear, the upwelling of defeat. Yes, giving the Sheikah to Ganon had weakened Zelda as they'd anticipated. Perhaps she would be angry, perhaps she would be cut off from the power by this imbalance inside of herself. It didn't matter. Zelda's thoughts filled the air like a mist, pounding on the exterior of Koga's mind like hands on a door, only kept out by the strength of the malice in his skull. He relished that panicked feeling, that sense of desperation. He had to hear. He had to know. He opened the door, just a crack. Just enough to hear the words the princess was screaming in her skull. Oit, oit, oit. There had never been a sunrise so bright as the light filling the canyon. Then he had thought she would rush to Paia, leaving herself vulnerable to his attack. He had thought he would kill her, and secure Ganon's victory. When she turned to him, the golden light underneath her skin, the fullness of the power of the betrayer swelling in her body like a liquid that sang the song of creation, there were tears in her eyes. And yes, there was fear. The beginnings of grief, too, which was held at arm's length. Urgency. And fury, unspeakable, a human fury. With a warrior's eyes he saw her assess him, identify him as the primary threat, and then there was no distance between them. He lashed out with all of the power in his body and she turned the blow aside as if she was swinging a shield that wasn't there. The outpouring of his strength did not shatter the walls of the canyon. The stone was blown apart, propelled into the north, where rubble would rain in the highlands for miles and miles. Her face was right in front of his. She was looking at him. Not at the malice, not at the body he had built for himself out of Ganon's power. At him. I have not shaken like this since the castle, he thought, because it was true. The fight that followed wasn't physical. There was a physical aspect to it, of course. Zelda was wearing armor made in the ancient Sheikah style, wielding an enormous sword with rows of shredding, rotating teeth. He moved lithely, quickly, but she anticipated his reach and caught his Ganon-given hand with that unkind weapon. Her power flowed through it. The hand exploded, was replaced. She was on him, cutting into his chest. Fighting like a woman who did not understand how to fight but understood, intrinsically, how to do violence. There was that element. More important, though, was the battle that took place invisibly between them. They occupied the space where souls might connect with one another. He armored in Ganon's strength and she overflowing with Hylia's. If he won here, then nothing that Zelda did in the physical plane would matter. As soon as she was defeated here, her life would wink out all at once. It should have been a glorious thing, he reflected, fighting against the Liar goddess with the strength of her destroyer. Even if he were to lose, was the ultimate fulfillment of the purpose of the Yiga. But it wasn't. Something was wrong. He threw his hate, not just his hate, but all the Yiga's hate, 10,000 years of hate, across the void, and that hate was scooped up and amplified by Ganon's hate. Ganon's hate that was so vast that the grievances of the Yiga felt almost petty in comparison. It was a hate that could break the world. It struck her, and there was a sound like a bell as it struck the fullness of her heart and was turned aside. She moved across the void, arms reaching for him. He met her in the center, meant to wrestle with her, to break her with the enormity of Ganon's blessing. But she was living light in his grip, slipping between his fingers and sinking talons into his flesh, and then the light was inside of him, eating at him. He bit her, then, willing the malice through his fangs, willing the malice to blot out the light, to darken the world without any hope of a new dawn. The light was in his mouth, plunging down his throat, rising up and into his brain. It was everywhere. It was everything. He had never felt anything like it. He had never dreamed of anything like it. The Yiga did not have space for such possibilities in their teachings, in their worldview. He screamed in agony as the malice burned and the light ate away at everything he had thought himself to be. But deep within himself, in the part that was still Koga, the man who had been raised on stories of the deep and petty evils of the royal family, he reflected that it did not really hurt. It was warm. Blue-green eyes locked with his, physically and spiritually, and he could not look away. That isn't Zelda, he thought. He fell to his knees, looked down. He was back in his body now, not just removed from the spiritual plane, but really back in his body. He was in front of the pit, he realized. His uniform was shredded, though his gloves were intact. His mask was back on his face. And Ganon was gone from him. Koga looked up. Zelda stood over him. But it wasn't Zelda, too. It wasn't Zelda, whose hair floated as if blown by a strong wind, whose golden blood ran down her shoulder from a bite mark that hadn't been inflicted on her physical body, who looked at him with eyes that had seen the world turn and suffer and rise and suffer again and again. She looked down at him from across 10,000 years of abandonment, of wrongdoing, and she had the gall to be weeping tears of molten light. They were not for him, of course. They couldn't be. They were for the girl. They were for Paya. "You are how I always imagined you," he said, with all the venom he could. The ringing of her power did not fade, but when she spoke, it was with Zelda's voice. "Please." He would not have guessed there was a place inside of him that was still capable of feeling what that word made him feel. He had given it up under the knife, had offered it to Ganon, had willed it away. Why would it remain? How could it remain? He made the sign of a crumbling lock, a rising pain, and behind Zelda the sand shifted as a chest rose from the ground. Zelda still stared at him. What did she want? Her goal was behind her. Both her goals were behind her. Why wouldn't she stop looking at him as if there could be understanding? Why wouldn't she let go of this moment? She had so much to do. She had already broken him. "Though," he said. He did not sound as angry as he had meant to. She damned him with the sadness in her eyes, lingering on him for 3 more interminable seconds before turning from him. The chest flung itself open, practically launching the thunder helm into her hands. She ran, then, still resplendent in her power. The false wall crumpled in front of her as if a giant had crushed it, and then she was gone, her light retreating into the fortress. The wind blew through the canyon. He rose to his feet, looking after the retreating girl, and did not tear his eyes away from the place where he'd last seen her back. If he concentrated, he could still see her, golden hair trailing behind her, the blue lights in her armor nearly, but not completely, lost in the deific radiance. Koga closed his eyes, breathed, tried to remember the feeling of her looking at him. How that had changed him? No, not more than Ganon had changed him. Not in moments. He had carried Ganon's power for years. What did that mean? He could feel it in himself. He was the same person he had been those long months back when he had first gone to the castle. Before Eden. But then, was he? There had been something in the light. The Yiga master removed his mask, tossed it onto the ground. "We are the true Sheikah," he said, to the presence that was no longer there. "We waited for so long, without a sign, or a word, or... And then, we prayed to you for so long. We wished so desperately to bathe in your radiance, to share in your wisdom. Did you know we would fall to the dark? You must have. What purpose did it serve? How much did it hurt her?" He clamped down on the thought. Tried to strangle it. Failed. Couldn't get it out of his mind. Couldn't. couldn't do anything. It was too much, all at once. How long have we toiled for nothing? A shadow moved through his heart. There was a moment, only a moment, where he felt dizzy. He had always allowed for the possibility that Ganon would kill him, one day. He was a fool, but he was not that ignorant. To serve the Destroyer meant, ultimately, to be destroyed. In some remote corner of his mind he thought that the light that had suffused him just now might have made him safe, might have severed entirely the connection between himself and his master. That was a foolish thought, of course. It had always been foolish. He began to burn. He looked down at himself as the fires of the calamity ate at him. It was more than just fire, was doing more than charring him. His very silhouette was beginning to dwindle. He wanted to writhe. Ganon wanted him to writhe, choked by agony. He did not. He was Yiga, was master of his own pain. But he did burn. He did weaken. He lost his balance. He fell backward. He saw the sky begin to shrink. The pit had been used for executions for thousands of years. If there was a bottom, no one had seen it except the dead. He would be falling for a long time, though he would not be alive for most of it. Consider Koga. He did not scream as he fell. He did not think of Ganon, or of the pain, or of any particular thing save one. He alone, of all the Yiga who had prayed and hoped and raged and defied the sky throughout history, had seen the face of the goddess. He fell, and he fell, and he fell, and eventually the darkness swallowed him. Paya did not, at first, understand where she was or what had happened. There had been pain, and surety, and emptiness. The taste of blood in her mouth, her sword in her hand, the radiance of Zelda's light passing through her and into the other woman, Koga's acolyte, Ganon's servant. Yes, she remembered. And then the hand, the dark, a great and terrible wind, a wind so great she hadn't been able to breathe. She still couldn't breathe. Why couldn't she breathe? Why wasn't her chest screaming for air? The hand. Ganon. She had seen, once, with the vision of Hylia. She did not remember the experience well, because it demanded a kind of sensory understanding that her mind had not fully mapped to in the short time she'd spent linked to Zelda. But she remembered the feeling, the context. What it had been to be more than a body, to be unfettered by her physical senses. Her soul had eyes of its own, she knew. Pai understood in that moment that she was not in her body. She had to see by other means. She willed herself to. Looked up. Do not think ill of her when I say that she was nearly destroyed by what she saw. There's a tendency to reduce the effective terror of something when it is translated to words or even to images. Distance, representation, and abstraction allow us to beg our scale to something that we can compartmentalize, if not actually understand. A Hinox may seem almost comedic in the abstract, but the reality of being next to one, of knowing it meant harm, would invest a kind of terror that is impossible to reduce to words. When Paya looked up with the eyes of her soul, she was confronted not with an idea but with a reality. The hand that held her, and it was so much faster than she thought it like a mountain, was like a mote of dust resting on a single leaf at the end of a branch split off from a bough reaching down to a mighty tree vaster by far than the guardian of the lost woods. But it wasn't a tree. It was a fire. It was a volcano, spewing death and hate. It was a storm, promising rain that would scourge the land. It was a stretch of desert wider than the world. It was rot. It was malice. And it was bigger than the universe. There, then, in truth and for herself, did Paya see the soul of the calamity. It shifted, and beyond it she saw another cloud of oblivion, equal in size to the one that held her. She couldn't understand. Were there two? Was there a whole cosmos of Ganons? Were they, everything? And why did that one in the infinite distance dance with blue lightning, when this one did not? The calamity turned its vast head, and it was like watching a planet spin on its axis. Golden eyes larger than the moon stared down at her. Oh, Bild. The calamity's voice was an earthquake, but she understood it still. I had hoped you might share in this with me. You've helped me so much, in my attempts to reach this moment. She was cold. In that place she could feel cold. What? Not actively, it said. All the active work was mine. Still, you will share in my triumph, I think. I have just tied up a loose end. Did the calamity smile? She could not tell. There was no mirth there. Do you know Koga thought of his people as the true Sheka? As if either of your tribes has any idea of what that means. His grip tightened, and she was caught between two tectonic plates shifting. She couldn't even scream. The pain was unlike anything her body had ever felt. It hated her. She understood. It hated her so much. It had so much hatred inside of it that there was no equal force in the world, and right now all of that hate was focused on her as if she had done every wrong that it had ever believed itself to suffer. Now. His grip loosed, however slightly, and the pain abated. If you don't control yourself, you'll miss out on the show. What? She said, wrenching one arm free, seeking purchase or a weapon or anything and finding nothing at all. What show? The hand shifted through that interminable space, and then she was in front of Ganon's face. She wondered if she would burn away at the heat and the light of its eyes, but she stubbornly continued to exist. Well, I should really show you. I think you could say you're the star, after all. She was rotated, made to look out across the vastness of infinity. In spite of that infinite distance, that infinite space, she understood where she was supposed to be looking and was able to see it clearly. She understood, then, the fullness of what Ganon had done, and what its plans were. She could see it in the shadows as her body lay smoldering on the floor, as Zelda moved through the fortress to find her. Months ago, Baya had believed that prayer was the only thing she could offer to the princess and the hero in their quest to defeat Ganon, that there were active participants in the battle for existence and there were those who were meant to support them. It was not a smaller thing, not a shameful thing, to provide support. She understood that. She understood, too, that support was all she had been. That girl would have wept to see what was coming. She would have lost herself in her wailing, and her fear, and the enormity of the evil that was about to be wrought. She would have looked on, still and silent and sobbing as everything she loved crumbled to ashes. She was not that girl. Hers was not the same soul that had faced down a lone yig on the road from Kakariko. Paya no longer had Zelda's blessing. She no longer had the weapons that she had used to fight off the darkness on so many occasions. She no longer carried Hylia's power in her chest. But she had herself. She had her will. Her free right hand she sharpened into a blade. She willed it to cut. She trusted against the enormity of the power that constrained her. The blade of her will bounced off of Ganon. She struck again, and again, and again, unceasing, uncaring if she beat herself to non-existence against it, if it destroyed her on a whim. She did not see as the calamity, however briefly, turned its attention back to her. She did not see that, imperceptibly, by degrees too fine to measure, she was growing in Ganon's grip. Liana, Lena, Fada, and Bada fought against the Yiga. The power of the blizzard rod ran dry, and the thunder arrows ran out, and then it was 3 spears and 1 great sword forming a barrier around the arena where Paya and the Yiga assassin had fallen. Their enemies harried them, taking their time, not pushing in too hard. They would pick an appropriate moment. Perhaps they aimed to keep the Gerudo alive until Koga should return and decide their fate. That is not what happened. There was sound, like the ringing of a bell, and a terrible golden light. It swept through the fortress like a wave, and the malice exploded at its touch, vaporizing and then dissipating as if it had never existed. Golden eyes crumbled to nothing and yawning mouths opened until there were nothing but blank spaces and black petals dried up. The Yiga and the Gerudo both looked in the direction of the light, Koga's room, as it swallowed them up. There went up a cry from the Yiga as the malice inside of them disappeared. Some of them succumbed to wounds that their infusions had barely been holding together, falling onto the ground and bleeding in great torrents. Most, though, simply looked down at their hands, found that they were no longer as strong as Ganon's hate had made them, and that they did not understand why their heads were so quiet. Zelda stepped into the chamber, the thunder helm in her hands. The Yiga shielded their eyes, and the Gerudo did not have to. They saw her, saw the thunder helm. Liana responded instantly. Bah! Grab the girl. The shaky girl. You fool. Stick with me. Liana and Lena both turned with their spears to make a path through the Yiga, but the Yiga parted, avoiding the Gerudo weapons entirely, staring openly at Zelda as she took slow, careful steps forward. The Hylian woman was shaking visibly and looked only to them, to Paya, limp in Bada's arms. Seeing Paya, Zelda grew very still. Barta flinched and lifted Paya up high enough to press her ear to the girl's chest. She listened for a moment, her eyes closed, as if blocking out the sound of Zelda's power, and then her face lit up in a brilliant, triumphant smile. "It's all right. She's still alive?" Taking Paya up and cradling her like she would have her own wounded sister, Barta ran ahead of Leona, earning her a shout that she ignored completely. It was all her squad mates could do to keep up with her. All four of them drew up to Zelda at the same time. Zelda was not looking at them as she handed over the thunder helm to the sergeant. "Put her on the floor," she said to Barta, and Barta obeyed, setting Paya down gently and then backing away. All four of the Gerudo turned again to the crowd of Yuta, Leona drawing her scimitar so she could still fight with the thunder helm tucked under one arm. They were prepared to fight their way out, as soon as Zelda did whatever magic she had to do to save Paya, but the Yiga were not moving. They were just staring. Waiting. Zelda knelt next to Paya, putting her hands gently on either side of the shaky girl's temples. Mytha's healing power flowed through her, reaching in and down, and did nothing. There were no wounds on her body. With Hylia's awareness, Zelda reached to the core of Paya's being, seeking some spark of the woman she had traveled with, the growing and thriving tree that had formed around a jewel. She found nothing. "No," she said, in defiance, and reached in again. Deeper. Feeling at the nothing, at the space where Paya should have been. Deeper. Deeper, until there was no deeper to go. Paya was gone. And then, in the very moment that she realized this, when reality asserted itself against her, smothering her hopes and validating her fears, shattering the world that she had been building, there was something. A shifting. A creaking. A roar. A hate. A hunger. Zelda pulled back, recoiling as if burned, staggering to her feet. She did not let go of Hylia's power. She still held all of it. She saw everything, felt everything, and understood perfectly as the air shifted around Paya's body. It was truth to her. She rejected it. Ah! The air shifted again, like the skipping of a heartbeat. Still facing them moving Yiga, the Gerudo looked over their shoulders as Paya's fingers tensed, her palms pressed flat against the ground. Slowly, slowly did Paya's body rise, with the languid surety of a person who had just woken from a nap. Tall stood Paya's body, and straight. No malice flowed from her. No power twisted the space about her head. Her eyes opened. The sclera were black, the irises were orange, stretched vertically, and emitted a soft red light. With Paya's teeth did Ganon smile. End of chapter.